My name is Megan Lee, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's event. As we mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the 25th anniversary of the Institute, we are proud to launch our new series, Liberty and Law. This series will explore the relationship between liberty and law from constitutional, political, economic, cultural, and ethical perspectives. Today's program is the first in our series. Founded in 2001, the Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and note the nearest exits. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Michael J. Illuzzi, who joins us today to discuss his new book, Mending the Nation, Reclaiming We the People in a Populist Age. Michael Illuzzi is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College. His work in political theory and American politics focuses on racial, gender, and class inequalities in U.S. political movements that have fought against overlapping injustices. His teaching and research interests also include critical community engagement, populism, peoplehood, and critical storytelling's potential to challenge dominant narratives. Illuzzi's recent book titled Mending the Nation, Reclaiming We the People in a Populist Age offers timely reflection on the challenges facing American democracy. Using lessons from the past, the book explores ways to strengthen civic trust, encourage constructive dialogue, and renew a shared sense of purpose in public life. Following Dr. Illuzzi's remarks, Professor Galdieri will join him on stage for a moderated discussion. We will then have a brief question and answer period. If you would like to ask a question, please wait for a student ambassador to bring a microphone to you before speaking. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael J. Illuzzi.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Ann Kamen, who organized this, and for Chris for moderating on his sabbatical. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk to you about the importance of stories, and in particular in politics. And when we think about politics, we often don't focus on the individual stories. And so what I want to do is start with my own story, and then talk about how that relates to the need to have mending stories in the US. So I think our political fight today is a fight over stories. And so like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own family story. My dad's story is what I'm going to start with. My dad came to the US when he was 13 years old by himself on a boat. He met his two older siblings, a sister and a brother, in New York City, and they lived in a studio apartment. There was 4 of them there. There was no shower or bath. He used a public bath in New York at the time. And you know, he tells a story how the first day he went to kindergarten and he couldn't even fit into this seat because he's a 13-year-old, and they're like, well, you'll figure it out. Here's a seat in kindergarten. So he had a difficult time for his childhood. My mom's story she also had a difficult time. At 13, she really became a surrogate mother. My grandmother had some kind of blood disorder. We don't know what kind, but basically became disabled when my mom was 13. And my mom ended up taking over all of the motherly duties at the time in a fairly patriarchal household. She did all the laundry, she did all the cooking, she did all the cleaning for the whole household. And she was trying to get her degree with undiagnosed dyslexia. At 16, she worked as a manicurist, a pedicurist, did acrylic nails, and she did that for her whole life. And they both had a dream. And they met each other at San Gennaro's feast. I can remember going there every year, and it's because that's where they met. They shared the dream to give their children what they didn't really have access to. And they succeeded in that, but it took a lot of sacrifices. My dad was proud of being Italian, but he also wanted his kids to not be Italian and to be American. He would not teach us Italian, which was really frustrating. I actually learned it in college instead. He also had to really think about how his sons would fit in, because he didn't fit in. He was from southern Italy, coming in the 1950s. There was a lot of discrimination against them, and he didn't want his sons to have the same kind of discrimination that he had. So he wanted us to fit in. And there's a cost of assimilation, and there's, my parents really wanted us to fit in. And I tell you this story because I think it's more than a family story. You all have your own stories, your own family stories. But this is also a story about the US. It's a story about belonging and exclusion, assimilation and sacrifice, independence and wanting to become part of we the people, and what does it take to do that? So the family story fits into a larger national story. Why do stories matter? Stories shape who we think we are, both as individuals and as communities. Stories shape who we think belongs. Story shapes who we think does not belong. And so I think if we do not understand today the stories that are shaping the moment now, we won't know how to respond to that. We won't know how to act in the present moment. Because stories are how we become a we. When we say we, the people of the United States, what do we actually mean? There's 360 million people. We don't know very many of them. But it has to have a sense. It has to connect with our own family story. I think we know this already. We battle over stories all the time. If you look at curriculum battles over what stories do we tell kids, what stories get into the textbooks, there's huge battles over that. If you look over how do we tell the story about our own history, there's a 1776 project, there's a 1619 project. So those are two competing stories about what does we the people mean. And these are competing visions of America's meaning. And oftentimes I think today we are sort of redirecting our questions to the wrong places. We'll ask questions like, is this fascism? Is this authoritarianism? And I'm not saying these categories aren't useful. They are. We need to be able to categorize things. But they give limited guidance to what we should do in the present moment. Labels really don't tell us what to do. I think a better question is, what stories are people telling today? What stories on both sides are they telling, and what stories are opponents telling on both sides? And then we can use our ability to see patterns in history to understand how to orient ourselves today. How do they compare to past crises, and are there lessons that we can pull from that? And when we look at that history, stories have forged new coalitions in the gravest moments in US history. So it's not like this is the first time the US has faced a crisis. There's been lots of arguably equally difficult crises. And in each of them, I think there have been mending stories and bleaching stories. And I'll tell you what I think they are in a second. I want to give you an example, though. So this is kind of abstract at the moment, right? I talk about mending and bleaching stories. Well, all of you know who Abraham Lincoln is. But before Abraham Lincoln became the candidate of this new Republican Party, no one thought he was going to be president. He was a very unlikely candidate. He was not one of the favorites. And he was running as a Republican, which, well, we now know the Republican Party became the party that it did, but people at the time didn't. They got trounced in the previous election. So Lincoln had this really difficult task. he had to put together a new party with people who didn't like each other. The Republican Party was made up of the former party, which was called Whigs, and he also had to attract some Democrats, especially Northern Democrats, German and Irish immigrants in particular. And they didn't like each other. The Whigs didn't like the new immigrants didn't like the Whigs who they thought looked down upon them. So how did he put together this new coalition, and then how did he hold together the Union? I think Lincoln actually engaged in a new founding of the country. He changed the story of what we the people meant. He reframed the story around the Declaration of Independence, which is apropos given the theme of this. And what do I mean by that? Well, when he says in the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago our fathers brought forth, what is he invoking back to? Not the Constitution, but the Declaration. And that was a new kind of move. And he was basically saying this country, its premise, its unrealized promise, is that all people are created equal. And people knew that this was a new story. There's editorials that were written in Chicago at the time saying, wait, he said what? That's not what the founders wanted. The founders had enslaved persons. So why he's making this up. And of course, the truth is that there were both sides. But Lincoln's story won. Lincoln basically said, if you extend slavery into the new territories, what does that mean? That slavery isn't going to die in the US. And you can't have a country that proclaims all people are created equal and then say, well, some people are superior and other people are going to be kept enslaved forever because they're inferior. And letting that happen would destroy the Declaration, would destroy the unrealized promise. And he convinced these factions, if you allow that to happen, what's going to happen? Well, you could be next. To those Irish and German immigrants, look, you start, excluding the Catholics, like the Know Nothing Party wants to. What's going to happen? You're going to be next. And to the Whigs, if you go down this path, you are going to set up a place where free labor is not actually going to be free. And so he convinced these opponents to join together, and then he made the same sort of argument to support the Union. That, look, if we believe in the unrealized promise of the Declaration, we need to believe that, this is what the country means, not what his opponents were saying it means. So who were his opponents? Well, his opponents were Senator Hammond, James Henry Hammond, and he had this idea, he called it the mudsill theory, which was very popular at the time. He basically said, look, in all societies, there's a certain group of people who have to produce, and then there's the superior people who actually create civilization. And of course, Hammond thought the inferior people should be black people. And he said, the Northerners and the white, they want to make white people into the mudsill. And that's not good because white people are superior to black people, and so the North is all messed up. They're not obeying the natural order of things. So that's one set of opponents that Lincoln was arguing against. And this is like an early version of a bleaching story. A second version is Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty argument. You might be familiar with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is the Douglas from that. And Stephen Douglas basically said, if these Western territories want to become slave states, let them become slave states. If they want to become free states, let them become free states. And Lincoln said the same sort of argument, that again, if you say that slavery is okay, you undermine the unrealized promise of the Declaration. And so that can't stand. It sounds good, but you're undermining the very reason that we came together and we threw off King George III. So what are the characteristics of these kinds of bleaching stories? They call a return to a purified past. So Hammond was saying, look, this is the order of the things in the South. We've actually created this wonderful sort of utopia, and these new ideas that people are going to be equal, that Lincoln was sort of talking about. These are threaten society, and we need to return back to these traditional ideas. The superior rule and the inferior serve, and there's always a creation of a real Americans and then outsiders who aren't real Americans. The other thing that you can see in the bleaching stories is how do we return to that past? We restore the nation by exclusion. There's impurities that are coming in, usually foreigners, and we need to bleach that fabric and return it back to its former state. So that's just one example. In the book, I go through all these different time periods. And in each of the time periods, there's the same pattern of what's fighting those bleaching stories, and I call these mending stories. What are the characteristics of mending stories? Well, all of the mending stories, remarkably, all harken back to the Declaration of Independence. They affirm the Declaration's unrealized promise of equality. It's not that the U.S. has achieved this equality, but that we're working towards achieving it, that it's a worthy goal to keep moving towards. They all also linked equality with religious morals. And the idea was love thy neighbor as thyself. Or, we're all equally children of God. These are invoked in different ways. But the point was that same point that's in the Declaration of having each person have equal moral dignity has to be recognized. And it's recognized in all of the major religious traditions. And they all invoked actually an opponent. And this might be more controversial, but if you look at these examples, they all identify who is causing harm, who's working against the Declaration, and naming them. And I do think it's important that they do this, and we could talk more about the dangers of that as well. And the fourth characteristic is that it's forward-looking. It articulates a vision for the future. It's not hearkening back to an age that never really existed. It's saying, look, we can get to this new vision. We can move towards the Declaration. We might not ever be able to achieve it, but we can move towards it. And so, like I said, you can see this in all the crucial moments in American history. So I look at the Civil War with Lincoln. I look at the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era with a mayor from Toledo who was known as Golden Rule Jones. I look at it in the Great Depression and the New Deal, where there was this rising fascism, and I think we forget how big the rise in fascism was during the 1930s. There was massive rallies at Madison Square Garden, packed with people who had swastikas next to George Washington on the stage. You had during the Black Freedom Movement, sometimes we refer to it as the Civil Rights Movement, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had people like Martin Luther King Jr., you had Fred Hampton in Chicago, and they were fighting against other bleaching stories. In each of these cases, mending stories fought bleaching stories, and often successfully. So I think we can look back to these lessons to help us today. Why? Because it provides models for what has worked before. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what can we do if we don't like the way things are going. And I think looking at history can help give us some lessons. It also places the democratic backsliding in perspective, right? The Civil War was a really dangerous time, right? We have been in these dangerous times before. The Great Depression, when there's 25% unemployment and all the European countries are moving towards fascism, is a really dangerous time. So this isn't unprecedented. In some ways it's unprecedented, but in other ways it's not. And so we can see what worked in these other crucial moments and then try to draw lessons from it, or so I argue. So what does that tell us for today? Well, I mean, stories, I think, are incredibly powerful. And if you don't tell a powerful story, you're not going to get any traction. I actually think the MAGA story is quite coherent and quite powerful. It offers a diagnosis of why we're in the situation we're in. It offers a sense of identity, and it offers a sense of restoration when people think things are not going in the right direction. It tells a clear story. Anthropologists and have studied this. I'm going to use the research of Arlie Hochschild. And when she interviewed lots and lots of people, this is how they explained why they believed what they believed. And she sort of gave them, I'm hearing you say this. Does this metaphor work? And they said yes. So this is how people were interpreting it themselves. And she says, well, it is pictured like this. She uses a metaphor of a line. People feel like they're standing in a line, trying to achieve the American dream. And they're doing their best to do so. But it's sort of slow, and it's not moving forward. And it's not moving forward, then people keep cutting in front. All these newcomers keep cutting in front. Immigrants, women, people of color, they keep cutting in front. And the government favors these newcomers over those who built the country and made it great. And I think that's a compelling story, right? You could use family stories and connect it to that national story. What's the competing Mending story in politics today? For example, what is the Democratic Party's deep story? I'm curious, does anyone remember Joe Biden's slogan before he dropped out of the race? Does anyone? That was the first one. How about one before he dropped out of the race? No one knows it. Finish the job. What job? I don't know what job. What was Kamala Harris's? There were many. But the official one was, let's win this. The election? Like, what do we stand for in that story? There's no moral narrative. How do you connect your family history to what that vision actually is? Why is it so hard to articulate a story? I think there's a lot of fears, and I think some of these fears are warranted. There's a fear of nationalism. Right? We know what nationalism can lead to. We know what it led to in Nazi Germany. We know what it led to in Mussolini's Italy. And so people avoid invoking patriotism, or at least not try to avoid it. There's a fear of exclusion. So what that leads to is a fear of naming opponents. Well, if we name opponents, aren't we going to just create this us versus them? And there's a fear of Christian nationalism, so they avoid religious language. I think it's too divisive. And what I'm arguing is, I think this is abandoning historically successful strategies. Lincoln used these strategies. King used these strategies. FDR used these strategies successfully. And I think these fears are getting in the way of actually using those strategies today. I do think there are emerging Mending voices. James Tallarico is a candidate for senator in Texas. I think he is developing a Mending story. Much more progressive Mending story is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So they have different ideologies, moderate to super progressive, but there's a similar narrative structure that they're advancing. They talk about patriotism, they talk about the importance of having moral clarity, they talk about a vision for the future, and they spell out what that vision actually means. But these are exceptions. If you look larger, the movement, like Move On, has developed this idea of no kings. And I think as a slogan, it's a better story than finish the job or let's win this. But there's also something missing from that, because it's talking about democracy, which is important. And no kings does get at the Declaration and its commitment to democracy. And the idea in the US, which was very different, that we're not going to have kings, we're not going to have titles of nobility, right? So it gets at that. But also fundamental to that, and what I think is missing from the conversation, is democracy is inseparable from this idea of having economic independence. And that idea of having economic independence was part of what the Declaration has always meant. You couldn't vote in early America if you didn't have property. Why? Because you were assumed to be dependent on someone else, so you would vote the way they voted. So from the very start, there was an idea that you can't be really free if there's not economic independence. And you can't have economic dependence in a royal court, where the corporations basically have to bow down and say, do I have your favor? And so if you want economic independence, if you want to be able to make your own way, you need democracy. And that link between democracy and economic independence really isn't being spelled out today. There is no freedom under arbitrary rule. You need a rule of law that's actually followed to have economic independence and to have rights. I do think if bleaching stories win, there's a lot of negative consequences that can come from that. Citizens become dependent on leaders. Hierarchy replaces democratic equality, and we become subjects instead of citizens. And that would be the abandonment of the American experiment that started with the Declaration. So when I talk about mending the nation, what does that mean? It means pushing forward, not trying to harken back. There's no ideal time that we can return to. And a lot of people would be in much worse state if we return to, pick a, I don't know, 1950s or whatever you think is the glory days. I also think we need to lean into identities that people care about. We need to talk about patriotism. We need to talk about religious morals. And we need to talk about who actually holds power and can change things. We can reclaim we the people. Lincoln reclaimed we the people at a time when it was uncertain who was going to win. And we can still do that today. And we can keep moving towards the unrealized promise of the Declaration. Will it be too late? It's not the first time in US history that we're dealing with bleaching stories, and it's not the first time that bleaching stories look like they might win. I do think there are some particular challenges today, and I do want to note them. The media environment today is different. I think it's qualitatively different. Media environment with algorithms are fueling polarization. There's a lot of emerging scholarship that is true, and that was not true in the past. Two, the amounts of money in politics is undoubtedly more in the past. Also, partisan gerrymandering is also increasing. Now, why is that important? Because it puts an insulation between the people and the representatives. So now the representatives don't care what public opinions say, they care about their constituency. But if their district has been so gerrymandered that it's over 60% from their party, they almost can't lose. So they don't have to listen to what dissent says. And that's different. And the money also is different because, again, they're insulated. They don't really listen to people who don't have economic means anymore. I do think there is still time. I am not confident that people will wake up in time. But I do think what story wins, and this is true in history, we have some power over that. The story that wins is in our collective hands, and we need to step up to that moment, because people in each of these time periods, they didn't know if they were going to win. It just ended up, some of them they won, and some of them they lost, but the dream of the Declaration lived on. Thanks.
Side jokes about the computer lab on the 12th floor of the social sciences tower at the University of Minnesota, or anything like that, but I can't make any promises that there won't be any. So thanks so much for that talk, and we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll open the floor up to some questions. So I guess let's begin at the beginning. When did you first realize that there's something politically important about the way Americans tell stories about we the people? Was there a precipitating incident? Did you come across something historically? What led you to this project?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So I love to teach, and I came across the topic because I had a problem with teaching. I started teaching in 2009, and it was my first semester at my job in Wisconsin. And I was teaching about racial inequality, and a student raises their hand and says, and this is about a third the way through the semester, raises their hand and says, "Why are we talking about this? We have a black president." And another hand shot up, and I called on her, and she goes, "I can't believe in 2009 that we have someone who could say that." And it was dead silent in the room. And I worked really hard to try to explain both sides of the where people were coming from, and I never got them back. I don't know. And when you're teaching in a classroom, there needs to be trust amongst the students, and there wasn't trust in that particular class, and that bothered me. And I was like, I'm going to be teaching this racial politics class a lot. What happened in this classroom? And I realized what happened was that I was not telling the stories in a way that the students could relate to them. So the first individual who raised his hand was from a farming community that had been ravaged by the Great Recession, and was like, why are we talking about these inequities, these racial inequities, when my town is really suffering? I don't want to be talking about these racial inequities. And the second person who raised their hand, who said, this is a ridiculous comment, grew up in Milwaukee, a black student, saw all of the discriminations, because the Milwaukee public schools are some of the most segregated in the country, and was like, I can't believe someone doesn't see this. And I think both of them saw me talking about the history of racial oppression and said, where am I? And so from that, I started teaching that class through, there was a TV show, I don't know if you've heard about it, but it was The Wire, where they talk about issues of poverty, and they talk about race, and they talk about how the American dream is failing. And every person in that classroom could relate to that story in one way or another with the different positions that they took. That works, right? And so I realized that stories are are how we orient ourselves. And if we want to connect with people, we have to do it through our stories. And so then I was trying to figure out, well, how did people do this in the past? How did political leaders change the story so people could deal with the politics of the day? And so it was later that epiphany, and then many years I brought it to the research.
Yeah, by my count, 17 years, which is about right for academic writing. So
don't rub it in.
No. All right. You also, in the book, you talk about Martin Luther King Jr., and specifically this metaphor he used of a garment of destinies, the idea that Americans are all tied together. What does that mean in the framework of the story you're telling about stories? And how does that help us distinguish between what are mending stories and what are bleaching stories?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I love the metaphor that King put out there. Why? Because he insisted that there aren't two different garments. There's not like a black garment and a white garment. There's, in fact, the United States, right? If you think about what it represents, it's an amalgamation of all sorts of culture and ideas, and the country was built together. And there's no pulling that apart without destroying all the communities within it. And so by having there's a single garment that's torn but needs to be mended. I think that is the image that we need. We are all in this country together, and it was built by all the different people in many different situations. I'm not saying that we all went through the same kinds of situations. But if we remember that, then the thing that we are trying to save is a collective thing, right? It tells you why should you, Daniel Allen talks about how we need to be friends to strangers. Like that's what a thriving political community would be. Well, it's not that if we think we're separate, right? When King talks about the beloved community and he talks about love, when you love someone, it hurts to see them in pain, right? Like, I don't know, I remember when my child was in the hospital. It hurt more than when I was in the hospital to see them in so much pain. Now, we're not going to have that same kind of connection to the people we don't know. But we do know that we do feel for other people, right? When something horrible happens to an American and we're like, that's really unjust, we can feel something. We just finished the Olympics, right? We probably cheered for people from the United States a little bit more than the people from other countries because we're part of the same story. And that single garment is basically saying like all men are created equal, right? Everyone has equal moral dignity, and therefore we should care about what happens to them. They're not separate from us. And if we tear them apart, we're tearing ourselves apart.
Okay. The Olympic example made me think of how everybody winced when Lindsey Vonn wiped out early on. Just like, oh God, not her. That's awful. In your conclusion, you make a point, and I think there's an important one, that the difference between mending and bleaching isn't one that breaks down along left and right lines, that you're not talking about ideology, you're talking about types of stories. Can you give us an example of a conservative mending story or a progressive bleaching story and what the difference between those might be?
Yeah, so, sort of the left-wing bleaching story that I talk about in the King chapter, is actually in the Fred Hampton chapter, is Mayor Daley of Chicago, a Democrat. He believed in sort of this idea that, well, all of this advocacy for civil rights is an attack on basically neighborhoods like he lived in, and he thought that the civil rights movement was basically, he was almost pioneering this language of law and order, that it was creating chaos in the streets. And therefore, he had some tactics that he would use. He basically said at one point, we should shoot to kill arsonists. And so he was drawing this line between who's in and who's not, who's a real American and who's not. And in terms of right-wing mending stories, there's lots of them. In my class, I teach about Theodore Roosevelt, and he talks about Americanness. That's a mending story that he's putting forth. I think his views on assimilation, my students don't particularly like that because he didn't want hyphenated Americans. He wanted just Americans. But it's a mending story as well. He's like, we accept people in the United States from wherever they come from, and we want their contributions. It is what makes the United States a wonderful nation. Eisenhower would be another example of sort of a more conservative mending story. But the way it divides is ultimately, do you think there's a set of real Americans and not real Americans? And if you do, then it's a bleaching story.
Okay. And you also talk about Franklin Roosevelt, and the chapter on him makes a lot of really, it's a very nuanced take on the New Deal. Can you talk about how his story can be mending while at the same time he was putting forward a program that, as you described, in many ways excluded folks who weren't white. It excluded women from the benefits of the New Deal. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we make stories in different contexts. And the kind of stories we can make depends on what moment we're living through and what people believe. FDR was president, hopefully only four-term president, and he saw the challenges. And in many ways, a lot of historians have argued that he saved liberal democracy for the world. I know that's a grand claim, but Ira Katznelson makes that claim. And I think there is some credence to it because a lot of other democracies were failing at the time. Fascism seemed like the way. And in the US, a lot of people thought it was the way. Charles Lindbergh was wildly popular at the time, kind of parroting some of these Nazi ideas. So he was fighting that. But his coalition was broad. It was numerous, like he had huge majorities at certain times during his terms. But it was fractious as well. He had to keep the Southern Democrats in line. And they controlled all of the major committees, because they had been there forever because of the way voting worked. A lot of blacks were excluded from voting, and therefore the seniority controlled all the committees, which meant that he could not advance any of his New Deal programs to deal with the Great Depression, the biggest economic threat one of the biggest in American history, without going through the Southern veto, basically. And so that put him in a really difficult situation. So he's telling this Mending story saying, look, we need to preserve liberal democracy. And in order to do that, we need to pass these New Deal reforms, because if unemployment keeps being 25%, you know what people are not going to do? Keep democracy. They're going to turn to the communists. They're going to turn to the fascists. And the only way we can save liberal democracy is to have these New Deal programs. So that was his overall argument. But in order to get that passed, he couldn't have those benefits go to everyone. In the South, they were saying, you can't have my tax dollars going to black residents. That's not going to happen. And so there was anti-lynching legislation, and he said, look, I can't advance this. I think lynching's wrong, but if I introduce this, the New Deal goes up in flames, and nobody gets any benefits, and then the country is likely to turn to communism or fascism. So he didn't, and black people and women were excluded from a lot of the programs. Now, how they were excluded, not because it said this money won't go to black people and women. They said, well, we'll have a carve out. And they put all the professions that, that were occupied by black people and women in there, and then they passed that legislation. Now, that perpetuated inequities. It perpetuated, because you had redlining in government programs, it meant that segregation proliferated through the New Deal, especially after World War II. We built all the suburbs, and they were all white suburbs. And in fact, there was prohibitions on selling to anyone else. They wouldn't be able to get loans and mortgages, which were backed by the U.S. government. So yeah, it's a complicated sort of story, but it perpetuated inequities and maybe saved liberal democracy at the same time.
Okay. Many of your examples draw really deeply on religious language. And today we are in a position where you have increasing numbers of Americans who are religiously unaffiliated or skeptical of organized religion. Does that change the way, the impact that Mending stories can have on our politics?
That's a wonderful question that I don't have a definitive answer towards. I do think that people who are so I mentioned the candidate Talarico from Texas, and it wouldn't make sense for him not to talk about religion because that's the way he thinks about the world, right? And to the extent that people fear religion and are avoiding it because of this problem, I think that's the wrong thing to do. But are there other ways to get at these principles? I think there might be. I've been looking at how Zoran Mandani talks about religion. Obviously, you can't make the same kinds of Christian invocations that a lot of American politicians do. And he usually talks about Martin Luther King to talk about these same kind of ideas. Now, is that going to, I don't know about effectiveness. I don't sort of measure those kinds of things. But I do think that might have an appeal for different kinds of people. So I think we need different arguments sort of circulating around, like, how do we save the Declaration? And I do think religious, this idea that, I was raised Catholic, and I I remember my Christian brother teacher basically saying, he would ask us, "Who are you?" And the only right answer to that question was the children of God. Otherwise, he would just go back and forth, back and forth. And there is something really, I think, important about that links back to the Declaration, that we should treat others as we want to be treated. And so that, if some people get there through religion, I think we should be using that language.
Okay. You also talk about the contemporary Poor People's Campaign as the modern Mending story. What's that movement trying to do, and how does their storytelling build on or differ from what we've seen in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, many of you probably haven't even heard of the Poor People's Campaign. It was trying to follow up on what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. So if you don't know the history in terms of like King, at the end of his life, like when he was assassinated, he was trying to organize sanitation workers, right? Because his idea was, at first, he thought he could get basically white moderates on his side. And then towards 68, he was realizing that's not going to build the coalition. Those white moderates weren't going to actually change their mind. But you know who would change their mind? The people who were running up against not being able to like feed their kids and have real opportunities for them. So he started organizing amongst the white working class, the Latino working class, the black working class, all of them into a poor people's movement. Because he thought they actually understand it because they're living it every day, and they can come together. So the modern Poor People's Campaign is trying to pick up on that. Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris are the co-chairmen of that movement, and they're trying to build what they call a fusion movement. They're trying to get a lot of different people who have a lot of different issues and a lot of different interest groups stop talking about one issue. So they start their meetings basically saying, look at all the districts where there's voting restrictions. Look at all the districts where poverty is high. Look at all the districts where they have denied Medicaid. They're all the same districts. So whatever issue you are working on, this is the person that you should be working with. And you don't know them because you're in different interest groups. So they're trying to build that. They have organizations, I think, in over 45 states. But they also don't get a whole lot of news. So they're trying to, how does it differ from the past? They're trying to build a leader, like they call it a leaderful movement. So instead of having the one charismatic figure, right? I talk a lot, about these charismatic figures like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, like Martin Luther King Jr. They are trying to do it sort of a bottom-up, like how do you train people in their neighborhoods to be leaders, local leaders, and get them to advocate for a change in their actual communities. And so that's quite different. And I also think there's an understanding that we have to build coalitions around people who have fundamental disagreements. So for instance, a lot of people in the Black Lives Matter movement believe in abolitionism. That is, we should abolish a lot of the institutions that they would say perpetuate structural racism. And a lot of the people in the Poor People's Campaign would sort of agree with some of that stuff, but not like defund the police. And in their movement, they're trying to make room for people who have fundamentally different ideas about like, do we need to abolish everything or do we just need some sort of reform? And I think they're trying to make room for different, I call it different spiritual strivings, different ideas of what like human flourishing means and what the country means, and sort of put some of those differences aside and work on the things they actually agree on.
Okay, before we get to our Q&A, a couple of basically work-related questions. We have a lot of students here, some of whom are contemplating what their senior thesis research projects are going to be like. And bearing in mind that they don't have 17 years to complete that project, do you have any advice or recommendations for them to bear in mind as they work on their research?
I think be open to your own reactions to things. If you're reading something or you're listening to something and you're like angry at it or confused by it, follow that. Like you want to work on a problem that like really catches your attention, that you can work through and then try to figure out, all right, so why did that anger me? Or why is that confusing? Why was that unanticipated? And then if you're going to work on it in school, I would say, and then narrow it by 10. Because there's only so much that you can actually look at in a very short period of time. And that we all want to answer like the biggest questions. And oftentimes, pick that question in like the context of like your local community or maybe the college itself. Narrow it down. But that doesn't mean that you can't actually have interesting questions. So you want to start with an interesting question, but then you want to make it small enough that you can actually say something interesting about it. Because if it's about, the country and you're not going to do a survey of like 50 different states and localities and things of that nature.
Okay. And what are you working on now? Are you building on this project?
I am building on this project in a couple of ways. There's a special issue that's going to be coming out on stories of transnational peoplehood. So obviously, my book is on the United States, but I'm interested also in how are people building what we the people means across borders. And so the special issue is going to look at stories on labor, on the environmental movement, on the Jewish diaspora, the Palestinian diaspora, and how are they sort of building this we the people across borders? Because there's a lot of limitations on it because the way we set up politics basically in the globe right now is through nations. So that project looks at transnational stories. The other thing is I'm working on a paper on Mamdani and AOC because I think they are telling somewhat different Mending stories. They're often bunched together, but I think there's particularities amongst them that are leading to different reactions towards Mamdani as opposed to towards AOC. And then I'm working on a paper on transnational community engagement, which is a little far afield of this, but it's related to my teaching.
Okay, and final question before we open up for an audience Q&A. If someone has enjoyed your talk, where can they get a copy of your book?
University Press of Kansas website, and I think there's a discount code on the literature, so please use that because the academic books are ridiculously expensive. So yeah, that would be the best place.
Okay, and so someone's got a mic, so Tom, you see the hands come up here, some folks up here were the first ones up.
I don't think this is on. Okay, I've got a beginning for your story. If you look at all of the people in this room, as well as all over the world, we have one very important gene in common, our mitochondrial DNA. Mm-hmm. So we are all connected. Mm-hmm. All right, I think could be the beginning of the story. Also, several years ago, one of the politicians, who I don't remember his name, came up with a list of what we all want for ourselves and our family. Mm-hmm. And there were like 10 items on it. Mm-hmm. And I bet you this group, as well as your students, could come up with the exact same list. Mm-hmm. Does that sound like a beginning of a good story from somebody?
That's a wonderful question. And I think a complicated question. It's part of what the Transnational Peoplehood Project is trying to look at. Can people across borders, right, who have different family stories that they connect to their national story, also connect beyond that? And so I think it's possible, and I also think that does not mean we can abandon sort of the smaller stories. So I think the smaller stories are actually really important to the way people identify themselves. And trying to leap over it. So in the academic literature, they talk about things like this weird term, cosmopolitanism, where a citizen of the globe is basically what that means, right? And if you ask people, do you feel like you're a citizen of the globe? They'd be like, I guess so, but I'm not going to fight a war for it. I'm not going to pay taxes for it. I'm not going to make any sacrifices for it, right? And so there are different kinds of identity, and you can develop those kinds of identifications where people will sacrifice for it. So all these transnational stories of peoplehood, they're doing that, like it's not on genetics, but on like climate change, right? That's a good example of a common thing that we all are dealing with, right? But it's much, much harder to do that because it's harder for us to connect our family story with that story in exclusion, because every group, right, there's a group of exclusion, right? If you're a member of We the People, who's not part of the We the People? Well, we've set up democratic politics around spaces, right? We set up local politics in our towns. We set up state politics, New Hampshire. We set up national politics, and then we have things like the UN. And because of that, it's really hard for people to start feeling like they're We the People, that they determine, the guidelines. We want to be ruler and ruled at the same time, right? We don't want to obey someone else's command. We don't have the politics to do that outside of the established politics that we have now, which is on the city level, the state level. Until we do that, I don't think people are going to really feel like this is we.
Hi, Mike. I'm a fellow graduate of the same Minnesota graduate school. I want to tip my hat to you and then ask you a question that the one thing I'm not convinced of.
Yeah, sure.
And so the tip of the hat is, it's really great to read a political science text. I got to read most of it. That is historically grounded and theoretical while still being about politics, right? So oftentimes in political science, we go down to the granular level, and it seems like, how could anyone be interested in this? Or we go so meta that it's not even about politics anymore. It's its own jargon. I think you hit exactly that appropriate spot where a person interested in politics can pick this up and learn something that's helpful in politics. One thing I'm just not convinced about yet is the leaderful movement strategy, right? And I think my hesitation comes from all of you convinced me in the first part of the book about how effective these previous people were because they didn't allow just anyone to walk into the meeting and say, well, I'm a part of your meeting and I disagree with you, but I'm going to walk around as if I'm part of your they had brand awareness, right? If you're going to participate in a march with Dr. King, these are the things you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to advocate for this, no matter how much you want to. You have to go and start your own story. And I worry that the movement for Black Lives, for example, was so open that anyone could walk in, call themselves Black Lives Matter, and do whatever they wanted, and then the whole movement gets attached to that actor. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I look at things like the Arab Spring, where all these people were brought together through these loose connections of, Facebook, Twitter, and the moment things got really tough, it didn't have that grit and resolve that comes from being a part of I will use the word army. I don't mean militaristic, but army-like discipline to stay on message, right? And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about what you see as the potential of these more decentralized movements, when I think history kind of tells us you need centralization, you need one story. And I'm worried that leaderful movements become movements of isolated individuals who disperse the moment things get really difficult.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, the original comment and then the question. And I should say, I think there are problems to the charismatic approach. I think a lot of people have waited for a new Fred Hampton, a new Martin Luther King, a new Franklin Delano Roosevelt to come around, or Abraham Lincoln, and said, well, we don't have that charismatic leader. But I guess I also see problems with the leaderful, or maybe from your leaderless approach as well. And I do think that's a problem. And I think we have to figure out ways we can coordinate with one another. And I don't think that necessarily means, especially in our decentralized media, it's centralized in some ways and decentralized in others. Politicians are figuring out really clever ways to go over the established media, like newspapers, and talk directly to people. And that means they can organize people in ways that weren't possible before, right? Like Mamdani and Instagram, incredible what he was able to do with that. It's kind of like what President Trump did with X, formerly Twitter, right? And that allows you to kind of mobilize people much more directly and immediately. But what I think needs to happen and isn't sort of happening right now, that coordination could be sort of an umbrella organization, right? The civil rights movement, it wasn't just King. They actually had all of these groups working together, and then they sort of decided, well, King's a great speaker, like allow him to sort of lead this. And so in some ways, they did have the leaderful movement as well, and we sort of lost that. We don't have the coordination that the civil rights movement had in the 1960s. And if you want to have success, you need to have people developing what story are we going to be telling? Because it does need to have an overlap. It does sort of need to be the same story instead of 1,000 different stories. I don't think that means we need the one leader telling us what the story is. That's kind of, I think, dangerous to sort of be waiting for that. And then when you're waiting for that, you might go along with an authoritarian who comes along. And there's certainly left-wing variations and right-wing variations of that, right? So, and I do think the one thing that the leaderful model does is say, concentrate on what you can actually change in your own environment. And you can do a lot. I mean, local politics is really frustrating. I don't know how many town meetings people have sat through. They are long. But also, you could have 400 people in a room determining millions of dollars of a budget. That's real power in a way that my vote isn't going to determine what happens to the federal government's budget, right? So, like, if we can have more people participate in that process, it really would be advantageous. So I guess that my position is a both and. Like, I'm not saying, okay, if there's this charismatic leader, ignore him. But also, let's not wait for her. I think you need to build political power, the ability to act in concert with others on an organic level where you can. And we're way too individualistic and isolated right now.
Yeah, there are a couple books that echo a lot of what you're saying. Mm-hmm. One is Robert Putnam. I noticed you have him in your introduction, mm-hmm. Who was here, in fact, about a year ago with his book Upswing, mm-hmm. where he talks about the need to deal with what he called the I, we, I curve, where people in the 1900s were individualist emphasis of I appearing in most of the literature. By 1965, translated to we, and now occurred much more often, references to we, and then back to I now. He wants to see that reversed, obviously.
Sure.
And he does see grassroots activity as the key to that, coming up from the bottom to coordinate issues that affect people across the board rather than in the political divides. Mm-hmm. The other book is Harari's Nexus. Okay. And if you haven't seen it, his basic assertion is that history is based on, you're going to love it, stories. Mm-hmm. And I'm only part way into it right now, but I hear exactly the same issue arising from your perspective and what he's relating as a deep history mm-hmm. View. So I guess, having said all that, let me throw a real curveball at you. Okay. How do you see the influence of social media and AI stepping into this space and affecting the stories? I ended sort of talking about that a little bit because it really, really worries me. We have destroyed a lot of public spaces, even the semi-public spaces. You know, when I was growing up, there was things called malls where people would hang out. I grew up in Jersey. There was lots of malls, and people would actually hang out there. And that's not public.
it's sort of semi-public, but those have been kind of wiped out. And people interact online a lot. You know, it sort of creeps me out a little bit. My child will talk to their best friend, and they prefer talking online. I'm like, they're like, you can walk there. Like, just go over. No, it's better this way. And I don't really understand it. Now, the reason why I think it's concerning is the algorithms. Instead of choosing publics, we have algorithms choosing the publics. And they're choosing the publics not based off of what we want, right? We might want friendship. We might want to find people who are interested in the same things we are. They're interested in capturing your attention, making sure you don't leave. And your attention, and Ezra Klein's talked about this a lot, but like your attention is the most valuable thing you own. It's your time, right? We all get such short amounts of time. And so to have, I'm not saying that, you know, the people who run these companies, I don't particularly like them, that they're incarnate evil or anything, but their incentive is misaligned with what we need as citizens. And that means it's going to push us in a direction we don't want. And we don't have control over that. We can't tweak it, right? They can tweak it. And I think sometimes on X it has been tweaked. And I think that's really dangerous. And so I hope that we can regulate that. We can actually start trying to push back on it, because AI is going to make the internet full of crap, right? You know, there's academic theories that talk about the shitification that happens. I remember when Google came out. It worked. You could get your result. The first two things that you looked at were the result. Now it doesn't. Why? Because there's an economic incentive. ChatGPT starting this process of shitification, starting to bring in ads. They say it's not going to affect their results. Now. In 5 years it will. And so it's going to also push us in the same way. And so what's the problem with that? We become the commodity. We become the thing that's being acted upon. We invent these things to make our lives easier, and then we become the object they're working on. And I think that's problematic and scary. And unless we disrupt that, we're just going to be reading that crap. And we're going to be pushed to be consumers instead of citizens in ways that I think polarize us and put us at odds with one another when we shouldn't be at odds with one another.
Thank you very much. It was really quite interesting how you talk. New Hampshire's an interesting place. You know, it's, demographically, it's, fairly white and all that, but it has a lot of interesting historical aspects. It was like one of the only places that never had a lynching, and had the first black elected official back in the 1700s. So there's all these weird, the first integrated baseball team in Nashua, my hometown. So it was interesting about the shared stories, and I think it is hard to tell a shared story now because of the media landscape is so atomized. When I was young, I remember watching Roots, and that was something that was enormous. It was a mini-series that ran, it was a book, and then a mini-series that ran for a week, I think, and millions of people watched it, and now that shared collective experience we have has been reduced and atomized by much of the social media. And there's a lot of it is because there's money in it. There's an enormous amount of money to be made getting people pissed off and angry. Yeah. And that makes you, that's one of the hallmarks of the social media. It's like, God, they're, what do they call it, rage bait. You watch these things because they get you angry, and that makes them money. Yeah. And we, like you said, we're that experiment on that. So I just think that it's important to realize that there's that financial incentive from lots of those big businesses that were sitting behind the president during the inauguration, that there's money in atomizing and angering people and all that. And I think it's harder to tell a shared story, and it's harder to feel part of a whole and part of a group and part of a country. And there's also global incentive for cynical actors to spend money in America to shatter our unity. And there's so much about this country that is fabulous and wonderful, and the stories and the history. It really is a remarkable. It's one of the remarkable places in the world, and not just because I live here, but because I like history, and I find that there's always these things that people that come out of nowhere and become an inventor and change the world, and that's part of the greatness that we have in this country. And I'd hate to see it fall apart, but like you said, it does feel that it's fraying at the edges, and that the collective fabric may not hold. And I think that people need to learn as much as they can, learn to not be easily pushed into being angered, and try to live, laugh, and love, to use that cheesy slogan you see on everybody's wall. And appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a story for you.
Okay.
I thought I recognized another Jersey boy. But when I lived in Connecticut, I knew a guy who ran a business, and Connecticut had this idea of taking people and training people from the bottom. And manufacturers and companies could sign up for it. And he was very much a very liberal and very positive about what this was something he wanted to do. And so he found out when he did this that many of the bottom of the barrel, which is what he got, he had trouble motivating some of the black people, and he wanted to find out why. And so he'd ask them, and one of them said to him, and the gentleman was very much not well educated, but he was very sharp. And he said to him, "You can train me, but who's going to hire me?" And that was the reaction. So he was trying so much to be, get everybody involved. So his daughter went to summer camp, and his daughter came home from summer camp and said, "I met a friend, and I want her to come over." And so he says, "Well, that's fine. Why can't she come over?" "Well, Dad, she's black." And so he says, "Well, what difference does that make?" He said, why did you two get together and become friends?" And she said, "Oh, that's easy. We were the only two campers that never got a letter from home."
Yeah.
All right, I think that is the last question. So, Michael Illuzzi, thank you once again for coming and kicking off this series. Best of luck with your follow-up projects, and thank you everybody for coming. And I think we're done. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.